You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Listen, you can go onto corporate radio and enjoy yourself there, or easy music. There's all these options you've got. Or you could listen to podcasts, or you could sit out in the sunshine. But it's up to you. If you want to listen, you want to listen. Now, just in case you're interested, tonight we are having dinner at Nurada's, which is at the corner of Albion Street and Breeze, B-R-E-E-S-E Street in Brunswick. It's a South American restaurant with a Chilean flavour, I understand. We were there last month, went well, so we're back this month. So you're all welcome to come along. One proviso: pay for your food and drinks. If you can't afford it, let us know and we'll take the hat around. Yes, we still take the hat around. So there's that. Now, what else have we got this week? We've got that, yeah. Oh, yes, Radiothon on the 11th of June. Now, I know that you think 3CR will continue to exist for time immemorial, but unfortunately, we live in a private investment for private profit world, and as 3CR does not rely on government grants and philanthropic donations and corporate sponsorships and commercials, we're stuck with you, the listener. Now, Radiothon plays an important part in raising the necessary funds to keep 3CR on air for another 12 months. So if you are regular listeners, I encourage you to donate to the Radiothon. You know how to do it, or you'll get a letter soon or an email, whatever they do these days. The important thing to remember is it's on the 11th of June. That's for the Anarchist World this week. I'm hoping to raise, now I know I'm dreaming, but I like to dream. I'm hoping to raise $20,000. That's right, $20,000. But obviously, it's up to you whether this happens or not. Now, there is one important provision that if you do pay income tax, you can receive a legitimate tax deduction. Don't let the Gina Rineharts, and all those nice people get their legitimate tax deductions for their philanthropic donations. Why don't you join the rich and powerful and get a legitimate tax deduction for donating to the Radiothon here on 3CR? The Anarchist World This Week Radiothon is on the 11th of June. You'll all get lots of stuff virtually and even in the post regarding the Radiothon. So save your pennies, donate now. Now I'm going to do a dreaming, your dreaming, apologies to the castle, your dreaming Radiothon. I'm going to try to raise $20,000. That's nothing. It's nothing. You can spend $20,000 on a good bottle of champagne. Why not spend it to keep 3CR on air for another 12 months and listen to one of the many programs on this community radio station, the Anarchist World This Week. The sacred cows have come in with their begging bowls. We're about to, they're going to go out in the streets. They're going to be Hare Krishnas. Here we go. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. That's 3cr.org.au. My name is Joseph Toscano. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. Just like to remind listeners about the 3CR Radiothon. The Anarchist World This Week comes to you from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. 3CR is a community radio station that doesn't rely on government grants, philanthropic donations, corporate donations or commercials. That's what makes us independent. So if you can spare some money during the 3CR Radiothon program for the Anarchist World This Week on the 11th of June, now's the time to start collecting that money. And for all you other listeners around Australia, outside the 3CR broadcasting range, good news, there will be an alternative program for you, because obviously you need to support your local community radio station. If you wonder what Anarchy is all about, Anarchy Society is a voluntary, non-hierarchical society based in the creation of political and social structures which are based on equal decision-making and equal access to wealth. Why those two concepts? Simply, it's inequalities in power and wealth which create many of the problems, not all, but many of the problems we face as a species on planet Earth today. So let's move on. How sadness envelops me. The Labor Party has 93 seats. The Liberal Party has 42 seats. The Independents have 15 seats in the House of Representatives. In the Senate, the Greens will hold the balance of power, as they say. And guess what? Our new elected leaders are talking the same dribble. You would think that with a whopping majority, the Australian Labor Party would introduce a few reforms. Now, I remember Mr Albanese, our beloved Prime Minister, holding up his Medicare card during the campaign. What he forgot to tell Australians is that Medibank, now called Medicare, was introduced against an overwhelming tide of opposition from the medical fraternity and the corporate-owned media by the much-hated Whitlam Labor government. They had the audacity to introduce reforms which continue to have a significant impact on the lives of Australians, although most of us have forgotten how these reforms were created. Things like no-fault divorce, financial support for single mothers, and the list goes on and on. The introduction of Medicare, a universal healthcare system, the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, the extension of the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, and the list goes on and on. And to a significant degree, the Whitlam-led Labor government was able to pass this legislative avalanche because of the pressure which was placed on them by not just members of the Labor Party, but by the community as a whole, which wanted change. Let's move forward 50, bad maths, 50 miserable years. And once again, we have a Labor Party that has a significant majority in the House of Representatives and has a relatively progressive Senate, which can pass legislation to extend the revenue to provide basic services for the people of this country. And what do we get? The same old, tired economic arguments. Same tired old economic arguments. I can't believe it. Here we have Treacle down economics number 46. Productivity. It's all about productivity. And the Treasurer's big call is about productivity reform. We need to introduce productivity as a nation. And I ask, why? Do we benefit from increased productivity, or do we see more profits going to the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication? Is that what we want? More of that? More of us to be in debt up to our necks to keep a roof over our heads, educate our children, put enough food on the table, have some means of transport, and the list goes on and on? And what happens if we improve productivity, not by flogging a dead horse, because 80% of Australians are now employed providing services to the community. 80%. 80%. What are we going to do? Invent robots to clean people's bums in nursing homes? And that's the dilemma. You increase productivity by increasing mechanisation. Not in the old-fashioned way, but the virtual way, through artificial intelligence. Now, as I've said consistently on this program, over and over and over again, increasing productivity by using artificial intelligence does free up people from the drudgery of everyday work and the everyday existence. But the dilemma is that when you live in a private investment for private profit society and you are not part of that system, whether you're self-employed or a wage slave, the fact is you face an economic catastrophe. No money coming in, no money to pay for the essentials. Ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching. That's the reality of living in our society. When people talked about the cost of living crisis, which we're going through, it's about the same process. Irrespective of increasing productivity, whether you do it by, flogging people, or whether you do it by using artificial intelligence, you do it, as they say, intelligently. The fact is that the basic inequalities that exist in society will not only continue, but will be magnified, as more and more people will no longer be needed to be part of the productive process, whether it's providing services or creating goods in this country. So instead of talking about increasing productivity, giving taxpayers money to the private sector, what we should be having is a government that's got a comfortable majority. And let's not forget the Labor Party only received 35.5% of first preference votes around the country. So if they think their majority is something they can maintain forever and ever, they should think again. The fact is that increasing productivity and providing handouts to the corporate sector will in no way address the structural inequalities which exist in our society. Now, I'd like to thank those 970 people in the electorate of Flinders, the Blue Ribbons Liberal seat, who put the number 1 next to my name, and my name was 5th on the ballot paper. So obviously people thought about it and put the number 1 next to my name. That's just less of 1% of the people in that electorate. But at least there is a small group of people who no longer want to be fighting amongst themselves for the crumbs that are brushed off the corporate table. So instead of talking about tax reform, and when I'm talking about tax reform, I'm talking about introducing a financial transaction tax or a stock market tax or even nationalising this country's resources, natural resources. We're talking about providing more taxpayer funds to the corporate sector, for the corporate sector to provide services which should be provided by the government of the day. We're not talking about reintroducing a People's Bank, another Commonwealth Bank. We're not talking about ensuring that essential services in the hands of the state. We're not talking about significant tax reform. We're talking about more of the same. What's the point of being in government and having a workable majority and a sympathetic Senate and not use that to make major structural changes in this society. I mean, the thing about the Labor government during the Whitlam era is, although it was in power, I think, for less than 5 years, about 4.5 years, it introduced more reforms in that period of time than all Australian governments since the 1970s. More reforms that had a positive impact on people. So think about it. Do you want more trickle-down economics when you know what will happen in that situation? Do you want more highly centralised essential services which are controlled by the private sector in companies that are too big to fail? Or do you want change? And do you want significant change? Because over the next 3 years, we have the potential for significant change. That significant change will not occur while the Albanese-led Labor government has the ear of the corporate sector. That change comes when the diluted branches of the ALP start making some noise about significant reforms. It comes when the Australian people demand those reforms be carried out. There is no point tiptoeing through the tulips when you have a significant parliamentary majority. What's the point of being in government, and especially in a majority position where you've got 93 seats out of 150 in the House of Representatives and a Senate where the balance of power lies with the Australian Greens, when you're not willing to use that mandate, in inverted commas, to introduce significant reforms in this country? And that's the dilemma. Do we want more window dressing, more virtual, reforms which ultimately mean nothing? Or do we as a people want a significant change? Now, obviously, if you look at the Flinders result, the fact that I stood on a radical economic platform, most Australians, 99%, don't think that we need that change. But maybe as we go through this parliamentary term in the next 3 years and we see that the problems we face are magnified and that change isn't occurring, that the conditions will ripen for some radical economic reforms in this country. You're listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscano. I'm hosting today's program. Okay, let's move on. Now, I'd also like to make a sad announcement. Now, I assume most people wouldn't know Alan Richardson. He was a regular caller to Talk Back with Attitude on Community Radio 3CR, and I'll mention him again tomorrow. Alan Richardson from Berwick. Alan died on the 8th of May after a very long battle with chronic illness. He was a great trade unionist, a great radical, and he made a difference to a lot of people's lives. So I'd like to pass on my sympathies and condolences to his wife and family. And if anybody's interested in going to Alan's funeral, which will be in Berwick here in Melbourne next Wednesday at 10 a.m, give me a call on 0439 395 489 at the end of the program, and I'll pass on the funeral details to you. So rest in peace, Alan Richardson. Compared to most of the people in Parliament today, they can't hold a candle to you. Let's move on. What about the Prime Minister lifting a little finger? You see, ALP is a very interesting animal. It's a factionalised animal, like most political parties. And they made a very interesting decision. The factions came to in New South Wales and Victoria, came to an interesting decision. One was that the former Attorney General, Mr. Dreyfus is no longer part of the ministry, and the other is that another minister, Mr. Ed Husey, who is, is a bit of pro-Palestinian, a little bit like the senator in Western Victoria, one of the few Muslim members of Parliament, was removed from the ministry. Now, a Prime Minister has achieved a majority of 18 seats in the House of Representatives. All Mr Albanese had to do was raise a little finger, send a murmur through the party that he'd like these two former ministers to remain in the ministry. And I can assure you, knowing how the Labor Party works, they would have remained in the ministry. But no, you've already seen jockeying amongst the Labor Party aspirants for the Prime Ministership. Extraordinary situation when one of the few members who's raised his concern, Ed Husick, about the carnage in Gaza, which I'll talk about later on, finds he's no longer part of the ministry. Extraordinary. And in many regards, this highlights the lack of effort by a Prime Minister who's more interested in his own political legacy than actually achieving change. So let's see what happens. I'm sure the Labor Party faithful will, gravitate behind their parliamentary majority, but let's see whether they do anything. And maybe, unlike the Prime Minister, they'll be willing to lift a little finger to introduce some significant legislative reforms in this country. Right. Trade unionism. Now, as a regular listener to this program for many, many, many years, I think almost the 48 years the program has been on air, he's called the Wolfie. And he tends to ring in and give us non-solicited advice. And as an expert on non-solicited advice, sometimes I listen to it and sometimes I don't. And he made a very important phone call last week to the station after the program. He said, what about the trade union movement? What about the trade union movement? He remembered, being an elderly person, he remembered when the Australian Trade Union Movement took action regarding what was happening in the world today. They took action in terms of boycotts or refusing to, service ships or companies which were involved in atrocities around the world. For example, when Bob Menzies was shipping iron ore to Japan in the late 1930s, when they were involved in their atrocities across Asia before the Pearl Harbor, before Pearl Harbor, the Australian Waterside Workers Union had put black bands on iron ore being transported to Japan. And how about how the trade union movement was involved in the anti-apartheid struggle and their bans on South African companies? And closer to home, their support for the West Papuan struggle. The dilemma is that today we live in a country where trade unionism is equated with criminality. We live in a country where successive governments, both Labor and Liberal National, have passed legislation which has destroyed the trade union movement, not just in terms of actions outside their bailiwick of looking after their members' interests, but actually destroying their capacity to look after their members' interests by passing successive waves of legislation which have made trade union activity illegal. I mean, we like to jump up and down about China and Russia, denying people basic rights. But we never like to look in our own backyard in terms of our own legislation passed to not only regulate but destroy the trade union's ability not only to conduct humane activities regarding things that are happening around the world, but in terms of representing the interests of their members. Today, less than 12% of the Australian workforce is in a trade union. Less than 12%. In the 70s, it was in the about 55, 60%. And of that 12%, most of them are government workers. Today, it's illegal to take action to protect your members' interest, even whether it's safety interests outside an enterprise bargaining agreement period. And if you do withdraw your labour, individual workers can be fined up to $10,000 a day. And it has occurred in West Australia a decade or so ago. It's just an extraordinary situation. Look at the CFMEU. Here we have an organisation which is at the front line of radical interest. Now, I'm not saying the CFMEU hadn't been infiltrated by bad elements, but so many corporations infiltrated by bad elements. Insider trading, people, using their funds for their own little nefarious personal activities. It's part and parcel of human existence. But unlike any other organisation, when these allegations were made regarding the CFMEU, what we saw is the government passing legislation to ensure that significant elements of the CFMEU were removed, put in administration. In any other situation, you rely on the legal system. If there is criminal activity within a particular organisation and you've got enough evidence, you go to the courts. That's what the courts are there for. And to circumvent the legal system in order to satisfy some hysteria from some yellow press out there, you understand how things have occurred. So, Wolf, you're right. The trade union movement has been almost destroyed. And the fact is that we have allowed this to happen. You and me. Maybe not personally, but as a country. We've believed the propaganda. We've forgotten where sick pay comes from. We've forgotten where overtime comes from. We've forgotten where the 8-hour day comes from. And the list goes on and on. We've forgotten. Somehow we think that it's individual contracts which will somehow shower us with gold. The fact is, it's been collective bargaining which has created most of the situations that we take for granted. It's been that ability to collectively bargain and force, people who own corporations and businesses to provide reasonable conditions for their employees. And let's not forget that the basic wage in this country, I think, is about $900 a week. I think it's less. I think it's about $186 a week. Let's not forget that we had a period where there were no wage increases because of government interference in the arbitration system. Well, it's like all reforms. Reform movements push political parties to adapt a reform agenda. If there is no pressure from below for reforms, there won't be reforms, and those few things that we take for granted will slip away, gradually slip away. And before you know it, overtime becomes something of the past. You may have to spend a few more hours at work to keep your boss happy, and the list goes on and on. And if you're a small business person, you're not exempt. The growth of corporations, whether it's the Bunnings of the world or the Woolworths of the world or the Aldis of the world or the Coles of the world, the growth of corporations has been the most significant growth sector in the Australian economy over the past 3 decades.
You're listening to a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned to hear the rest of your 3CR podcast.
You're listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. That's 3cr.org.au. My name is Joseph Toscano. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. You can leave messages on 0439 395 489, 0439 395 489. You can actually write me letters at Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. Email me at info@anarchistage@yahoo.com or info@pibci.net. And while remember, you can always join public interest before corporate interest. You can do it online right now. It costs you nothing. Facebook pages, Joseph Toscano, Toscano for Flinders, you name it. josephtoscano.nam. Web pages, pibci.net. The list goes on and on and on and on. It's not about having the material out there. It's about people taking up those ideas and running with them. Otherwise, you and I, till the day we die, and it will be much sooner for me than most of the listeners, will be fighting for the breadcrumbs brushed off the corporate table. I'll give you an analogy, a simple analogy. Even I can understand it, so it's got to be relatively simple. Look, you've got corporations which are the primary aspect of our economic system, right? And a private investment for private profit economy, which is supposedly based on competition. We actually have a Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. How funny. You've got to have the government to set up a commission to ensure competition in a capitalist society, because capitalism leads to monopolies. You know that, I know that. So here we have, we've got all these, we've all got these corporations. And here we are begging for the crumbs brushed off the corporate table. We're waiting like little dogs or little cats, waiting to get their little meal, get their little pellets, all right? Here we are waiting. And occasionally they brush a lot of crumbs off the corporate table because we're a little bit restless and we're shaking the table. But if we don't shake the table, the number of crumbs that are brushed off, just enough to keep us happy. Pay our bills, maybe have a holiday once a year, all those nice things that you expect from life. Send your kiddies to school, maybe take them out on an outing. But, you shake the table, more crumbs brushed off the corporate table in your direction. If you don't shake the table, nothing happens. They keep the crumbs, not only the cake, but the crumbs. So what the Anarchist World this week is about cutting a leg off the corporate table. And if you cut a leg off the corporate table, the cake slips off the table and we all enjoy the fruits of the Commonwealth of this country. And if we're not willing to shake the table and eventually cut off one of those legs, we will continue to fight amongst each other for the crumbs. And when I talk about fighting amongst each other, I mean the last federal election was interesting, not in terms of the majority for the Labor government, because that was, remember, they only got 35.5% of the primary vote. It was the preference flow which obviously pushed them over the line. The interesting thing was how many small, even large, political parties were out there on the ballot paper which were promoting division and hatred in our community. To me, this was one of the most significant aspects of this election campaign, and how the Liberal National Party latched on to the hate mongers, believing the hate mongers would push them over the line. To their chagrin, their strategy didn't work. But there is a significant proportion of the Australian population that somehow thinks that the way forward is to beat up their neighbours. And beat up their neighbours because they have a religion, a different religion, or wear funny clothes or different clothes, or speak another language. And I'm not just saying it's the Anglo-Saxons amongst us. It's a relatively common feeling amongst many immigrant groups that we need to fight amongst each other to get our access to those crumbs as they're brushed off the corporate table. And it's quite sickening in many regards. The one good thing about the Labor Party victory was that this is the end of significant aspects of the culture wars. The culture wars will still be with us, but they are over. They're finished. I think younger Australians are beginning to understand, because of the situation they find themselves in personally, that going down the same path as their parents and grandparents is not going to suit them, because they are the ones currently who are facing the greatest existential threats which even have an impact on their existence, not only their lives. It's no wonder we have so many younger people suffering from anxiety, depression. Fancy that. You leave university or higher education, you settle for debt. Extraordinary. The Whitlam Labor government in the 1972 abolished university fees. I went to university between 1970 and 1975 to obtain my medical degree. Initially, before the election of the Labor government in 72, I relied on a Commonwealth government scholarship. But after that, education was free. And then we got the Hawke Labor government introducing fees, as if we can't even invest in this country's education, and that we have to rely on foreign students. Universities have to rely on foreign students in order to pay the bills, because there's not enough of our money going into university and technical universities and higher education facilities. How extraordinary that we as a people are willing to deny an increasing number of our children and grandchildren access to higher education so we can retire comfortably on superannuation funds which are highly dependent on stock market returns. Think about it. And then we have the housing crisis. Now, this is a wonderful crisis. I love it. All right. Now, we don't have 1 billion people in this country, or 1.3 billion people, and we don't have 150 million people living, I think, in an area about half the size of Tasmania. I could be wrong, say Bangladesh. We've got 27 million people living on a continent. We have a housing crisis. And everybody, including our beloved Prime Minister, tells us the way to resolve the housing crisis is to build more homes. For the private sector to build more homes. Now, the fact is, it's fascinating that almost every state and territory government in this country, including the current federal government and the federal opposition, don't mention the word public housing. Now, public housing was something which was seen by both the Liberal National Party and the Labor Party in the 50s and 60s as an essential component of the housing sector. Because irrespective of all the money you give away to the private sector to build more housing, there will always be a situation where some people will never be able to afford having a roof over their heads. And having a roof over your head isn't about having an asset which you can sell later on for a profit, and that's what we have today. But it's about security. It's about security of tenure. It's about knowing that in 12 months' time you won't have to move because you can't, renegotiate a new lease on the property you are leasing. And that means you have to uproot your children from the schools they're familiar with. And you may even have to change jobs because you can't find accommodation in that area. So you've got this constant instability in your life. And we're talking about 30 to 40% of Australians finding themselves in that situation, and mainly young people. Because with the turning of housing into a commodity via which superannuants were encouraged to invest in housing because of negative gearing and tax offsets, we have the situation where housing prices boomed to such a degree that they become unaffordable for anybody who earns less than $2,000 a week in terms of maybe even a combined income of a couple. You need at least $2,000 a week, at least, to put your foot in the housing market. And this has resulted because of a total lack of competition in the housing market, because the housing market is now totally dominated by the private sector. Now, those of you who talk to me about affordable housing, community housing, social housing, think again. These are private entities. They may be for profit, they may be for not for profit. These are private entities. And unlike public housing, they pick and choose. It's a little bit like having private health insurance. Private health insurance hospitals pick and choose who comes into that hospital, depending on the profitability of that organisation. And that's understandable because they're private hospitals. And it's the same with community, social, affordable housing groups. They increase their net worth and the number of houses under their control because of government guarantees, because of titles being handed over to them. But the fact is, they are not public housing. They can pick and choose tenants. They pick and choose what rent to pay. And then you get a mixture of people who have got relatively good incomes to ensure that those who haven't got enough incomes, there is a profit for that particular organisation. So what is wrong with us that we can't even afford or even think about the idea of public housing? Now, public housing does not have to be huge blocks where you put people who've got issues together. And in some circumstances, not all, but in some circumstances you create difficulties, right? You can spot purchase properties around the country. The federal government could do it, although housing is a state responsibility. There's nothing to stop them from buying housing, putting it on a public list and then asking their state government to maintain it as a public house. I mean, spot purchasing is nothing new. It occurred in the 80s and 90s, as far as I know, in Victoria. Nothing new. You don't have to build thousands of homes. And as more and more investors move out of the property market because the returns that you receive as far as rents are concerned are not important. What is important is the capital gains on the property. And if property prices have increased dramatically to such an extent that they've levelled off, there's not going to be any capital gains. So you may as well put your money in something else if you're a superannuant or an investor. So I don't understand this tragedy regarding public services, public housing, public transport, I just don't understand this revulsion. We seem to have this revulsion that somehow it's second class, that somehow that if it's regulated, owned and managed by the state, that it's somehow a second-class facility. And in many regards it is. It's a simple thing like public hospitals, right? Now, if you go to a private hospital, even if you've got private health insurance, which can be up to $800 a month for a family, that's $10,000, fair bit of money for public health insurance, right? Even if you've got, maximum cover, you've got public health insurance. You turn up at a public hospital with an emergency facility, and you turn up at a private hospital with an accident emergency facility, you'll need to fork up between $400 and $500, which is not refundable from your health fund, to access their emergency facilities, and then you will pay extra for any investigations or radiology which is performed. Now, obviously, the introduction of these after-hours emergency clinics is beginning to make an impact, because you can access these clinics with your Medicare card. But the fact is, because something is private doesn't necessarily make it better than a public facility. The reason we find ourselves in this situation is, and it's a never-ending cycle. We never have enough money for public education. We need private charities to raise money to send Aussie kids to Aussie's public schools. Extraordinary country as rich as Australia. I know I harp on about this every week, but to me, this is critical. And there's never enough money for public hospitals. Although, if you sustain a serious injury or you have a serious medical condition, in 99.9% of situations you'll find yourself in a public hospital and you'll get great treatment. In 99.9% of situations, not 100% of situations, there's always mistakes which are made by human beings in any setting. But the fact is that as far as all the other facilities are concerned in the public sector, they fall short. Years to make appointments with specialists, years to get, operations which are not essential, and the list goes on and on. And this occurs, as you and I know, and that's what my Flinders campaign was all about, is because of the revenue stream that goes into the Treasury, because the revenue stream is still almost totally dependent on income tax revenue from wage earners. Between 65 cents and 70 cents in every dollar which is raised by the Commonwealth Government comes from income tax revenue. It doesn't come from the mineral resources sector. No wonder we have billionaires crapping on about how horrible it is to have a Labor government in power, crapping on billionaires who should know better, who've made their fortunes courtesy of you and me, because we have allowed successive governments to give away this country's mineral resources to the private sector, to private corporations for a peppercorn rent. And we see the likes of Mr. Clive Palmer with his little vanity project, trumpets for whatever patriots, spending $100 million of money he makes from exploiting mineral resources in this country, because we have allowed this to occur as a people. So instead of using that $100 million in something that's a little bit more useful, he uses $100 million for a vanity project, I mean, it's extraordinary. It's extraordinary that we find ourselves in this situation in 2025. As I said before, here we are thinking that the public sector is bad and the only good thing in the world is the private sector. Everything needs to have a price. If there's no price, people won't respect it. That's why you can't have free public transport. And the list goes on. And it's bad for a reason. Because not enough resources are directed in its direction to provide those basic services for people. Now, I encourage you to join public interest before corporate interests. I must say, it's been an organisation I've been involved with for over a decade, and it's gained minimal traction in the community, exceptionally minimal traffic. Because people somehow think that if you vote for the same people that you'll get better results. Poor old Einstein would be, bashing his head against his coffin. I don't know if he was buried or cremated, but if he wasn't cremated, he'd be bashing his head against the coffin. The fact is, what you and I have seen in the last few decades is the Labor Party becoming the Liberal Party, and the Liberal Party becoming some type of arch-reactionary dinosaur. And nothing happening on the other side. And if it's happening, it's not gaining traction among Australian people. Now, people ask me, Joe, are you left or right? And I say, left or right of what? Left or right of that door? Left or right of that light pole? Left or right of that car? See, the terms left and right have become meaningless in 21st century society. They don't mean much at all. And when we look at things, we should be looking at things in terms of concentration of power and wealth. These are the two fundamental aspects of any society, irrespective of its cultural values. The buffoon goes to Saudi Arabia, a feudal monarchy, right? And he raves on about what a wonderful place it is. And he does a deal to sell him some shit, right? A feudal monarchy, total concentration of power and wealth in a minuscule number of hands. That's the dilemma. The buffoon signs an executive order, somehow thinking he's a dictator. No wonder he's so welcome in Saudi Arabia. No wonder he gets on so well with Putin. But that's the issue. It's about power and wealth. If you look at the world in terms left and right, you don't really explain what it's all about. Alfie, as they used to say, what's it all about? It's about power and wealth. It's about the concentration of power in fewer and fewer hands. It's the concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands. And as an anarchist and as a human being, I'm involved in the struggle to share power and hold wealth in common and use it for the common good. Motherhood statements, St. Teresa statements, But that's the fact. That's what human history has been about. It's been about power and wealth. It's about concentrating power and wealth in a minuscule number of hands. And that's what we have seen since the Second World War. We have seen the concentration of power and wealth move from the people to elected or self-appointed rulers. That's what the anarchist struggle is about. It's about breaking down those structures and replacing them with other structures. It's not about left or right, centre, left, right, mid-centre, mid-right. It's about real, concrete concepts. So if you look at a particular struggle or look at a particular policy, what's it about? Is it about concentrating power and wealth in fewer and fewer hands? Or is it about ensuring that the Commonwealth is used for the common good and as many people as possible are involved in the decision-making process which affect their lives? There is nothing naive about this statement. There is nothing utopian. It's part and parcel of human existence and the human struggle for freedom. Not a freedom which is esoteric, but a freedom which is based on not only the satisfaction of human needs, but the ability to go about our lives free of the constraints which are imposed on us. Thank you for listening to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. This program has been streaming live on 3cr.org.au. That's 3cr.org.au. The program is a podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. Don't forget the 3CR Radiothon, Anarchist World this week, the 11th of June, $20,000. You're dreaming. That's my Radiothon target. So let's prove the castle was right. There are constitutional arrangements. Let's raise that $20,000 to keep the Anarchist World this week on air for another 12 months on Community Radio 3CR in Melbourne, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. Listen in to the Anarchist World this week, next week on your local community radio station. What else can I say? You're a wonderful people. I could do a buffoon. I could say, we're the greatest, but I'm not going to say that because we're not. We're just part of the mass of people out there trying to survive in increasingly difficult times. Listen in next week to the Anarchist World this week.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.